Well, hello again, everyone. Welcome back to Peak Human. I'm Brian Sanders. I'm the founder of Nose to Tail and the Sapien Center. I'm making the Food Lies 6-part documentary, and I do this podcast to spread the good word about all the diet and lifestyle stuff, ancestral living your best life. And I appreciate all of you listening, supporting the businesses. These are just small things. These are just boutique businesses we have to support the big projects we're doing, like the film and the bigger mission. Appreciate you sharing this podcast with friends and family, giving a review on iTunes, going to nosetotail.org, checking out our stuff there. Here's a quick intro about our episode today with the Strong Sistas. They are great. I've known them for years. They did a nose to tail carnivore diet, found a lot of success and healing from that, and then moved into something called the pro-metabolic way of eating, which adds a lot more carbs from whole foods like fruit and tubers and honey, stuff like that. Really interesting episode. I've had a lot of these guests on in the past couple of years talking about leaning into whole food carbohydrates in a healthy way. You don't have to do a low carb diet. You don't have to do carnivore. You don't have to do keto. There are many ways to be healthy within this ancestral framework. There's so many bad diets out there. I think 95% of diets are bad, but there's some really good ones that are ancestrally appropriate in this last 5%. So I want to let people know that these exist. So many people reach out to me and they're like, hey, I can't do carnivore. It's just not working, or it's too restrictive. And I always say, well, why do you need to do carnivore? Do you have a specific autoimmune condition? Or do you just think you had to do it because some guy online told you you had to do it? So I think carbs could be eaten in a healthy way. I've been doing great on leaning into some more whole food carbs. And that's why we did this episode today. They also are into regenerative agriculture. They have their own ranch. They're living this lifestyle. They're really cool people doing great things. A little bit more about them. Ashley and Sarah Armstrong, aka the Strong Sistas, are powerlifters and nutritional coaches who are passionate about bioenergetic nutrition and regenerative agriculture. Suffering from autoimmune disease, the sisters have adopted an animal-based lifestyle utilizing the carnivore diet and the ketogenic diet, which has transformed their lives. Today, they live on a regenerative farm in Michigan, and in addition to their coaching practice, co-host the Rooted in Resilience podcast. So check it out, learn from them. We do a cool thing at the end where I ask them 3 different case studies and they give their opinion on what they would recommend to that person. We have each age group and each demographic, kind of male or female, different health situations. So wait till the end for that one and enjoy this one with Ashley and Sarah. There we go. We're live. We figured it out. How are you two girls doing?
Doing well.
Yeah, we're doing good today. Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, the weather has finally changed here in Michigan. And so I think spring is upon us, which makes life a lot easier on the farm.
That's great. I was just going to ask where you're calling from. What's your context? So you're on your own farm. So this is Sarah and Ashley Armstrong. Can you say who you are so we can hopefully tell your voices apart?
I'm Ashley.
Oh, yes. I'm Sarah.
And we are in Southwest Michigan. We started a regenerative farm almost 2.5 years ago, about 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. And we are kind of learning as we go. And honestly, it's been an incredible learning experience. And it's really made us even closer and connected to our food source. And it's kind of really been insightful as to how food should be grown. So, winters here are a little tough. And so, adapting the farming practices in the snow and cold, and then coming into the spring and being able to rotate the animals again, we have ruminant animals and chickens. So springtime is always a really nice time to be out of the cold and grass growing again.
That's great. And that was Ashley. And now Sarah. Yes. And tell us your background, Sarah. You have a PhD?
Oh, no. Ashley has the PhD.
Oh, I got it backwards.
So, So she's the doctor.
Yeah, I have a PhD in mechanical engineering that I'm not using. I would say grad school kind of taught me like how to learn, how to question things, how to read the literature, and be more inquisitive and question things. But I'm not actually using anything specifically I learned in graduate school. But I think it was a useful time to kind of expand certain skill sets that we now use kind of on our Strong Sistas account. So yeah, I have a PhD in mechanical engineering, and I would say that we're kind of health nerds. So we're kind of like obsessed with like nutrition and health, helping others with this, and also sharing about content on our social media. So Instagram, and then also on our new podcast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Awesome.
So my background is health sciences, so in school, and then I did some naturopathic work after that. But most of what we've learned and what we apply to our health right now came from just personal experience on the farm, and then, losing our health and then finding our health again. And so I'd say that our biggest asset has been experience in regards to, helping others and helping ourselves. And yeah, so that's how we got to where we are today, on a farm and nerds about nutrition.
I love it. Yeah, I have a mechanical engineering degree, and I think it really does help, especially because we weren't indoctrinated into the medical system and the sick care system and all that stuff. So we kind of came at it with fresh eyes, root cause approach, all that stuff.
Oh, for sure. You kind of see things. It helps you take a step back and look at things as like a system and question certain things. And yeah, I agree. Not having that like indoctrinated view imprinted on us kind of gives us a fresh perspective.
Absolutely. All right, got to jump in here and talk about nosethetail.org a little more. We get regenerative meat straight to your door. Put in an order. We pay half your shipping. We also have other stuff like body care products made from beef tallow, animal-based body care for your hair, for deodorant, for soap, all the things. We have an animal-based version with no funny stuff in it, with no fake scents, just real essential oils. This stuff is amazing. We also have dried meat. We got the biltong. We have livervores with liver mixed in. If you want to grab some liver on the go, really great product. Check them all out at nosethetail.org. We have free shipping options as well. So check that out. Support our ranchers, support our small business. We're doing great stuff just to get it out to great listeners like you. Thanks so much. Get your free Sapien meal guide at sapien.org. Put in your email and we'll send it to you for free. Thanks so much, and back to the episode. So let's talk more about your journey. I followed your journey for many years. I have always been in the animal-based space. Ancestral health is really what I call it. I started in kind of the low-carb world, or I got adopted by the keto community. I really just started 9 years ago with reading Mark Sisson's book, Primal Blueprint, which I guess is sort of, low carb. He's just saying don't eat seed oils, added sugars, and refined grains. And really, that's kind of also based on the work of Weston Price. So I really think the real grandfather of this all is Weston Price. I think a lot of people get a lot of their content from them. And I don't know if people realize that in the mainstream, that a lot of this stuff is just representing, which is super important, representing Weston Price's work. And yeah, I mean, along the way, there were other people that figured out even before him. I know there's some books written in the 1800s about that were very accurate on what causes obesity, because they just had a few people that were becoming obese, and they were the ones drinking tons of alcohol and eating like the few pastries and, refined sugars and grains that were around, into these, excess, right? It was like the rich people with excess. So anyway, Weston Price did a lot. Mark Sisson did a lot, and now we're kind of the next generation, I guess, of people trying to spread the good word. But I want to hear more about your backstory and your journey of your different diets, because I know that's a big thing with you too.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things to consider along someone's health journey is we live in a very weird environment, right? Like modern times presents a very foreign environment in terms of air, water, food to our human species relative to like our great grandparents. And so we are presented with a slightly different challenge in that regard. And so for some people, that has really set us up not for success from a young age. So I think it's important to consider like our upbringings and how our health was like established at a young age, what foods we ate when we were super young. Were we fed formula, or did we drink our mother's milk? And so I think how we grew up kind of impacts some of the health challenges that we are presented with at an older age. And then some of our great grandparents, like they didn't have those challenges necessarily. Like they were nourished from a young age. And so I think just remembering that can just remind you that sometimes you do have to take a little bit of a different journey. Sometimes you do have to restrict a little bit in certain food groups in order to regain health and regain balance. And so I think that that's been one of the most important learning lessons along the way, is just sometimes you have to take a slightly different path to regain balance and reestablish like a certain level of health, because of how, like, something that we've, I think, all recognize, especially Weston A. Price, is like how foundational the gut microbiome is, and learning at such a young age that your gut microbiome is established to some degree. And so the status of your microbiome, whether you are experiencing dysbiosis or leaky gut, so certain things like that will impact kind of what strategy makes sense for you right now along your journey. And so, gosh, from a young age, I think that we were impacted a lot by the mainstream health advice of, the standard nutritional principles of the more grains, the better, the more vegetables, the better, restrict animal products as much as possible, stick with chicken breast. And so we kind of really dove into those principles at a very important time, which was adolescence, right? When we were growing, our hormones were being established. And so combining that with like a super active lifestyle, I think we kind of started like 2 steps backward in our health at a young age. So we experienced health challenges, what some would consider early on in our 20s, with some autoimmune symptoms. And Sarah had like an official autoimmune diagnosis, some gut challenges. And so we've had to really experiment and dive into different nutrition strategies to try to mitigate some of those problems. And so
I think something we've recognized within the last probably 2 years now is the importance of generating energy and thyroid health and metabolism. And so when she's talking about all of these restrictive diets or exercising too much or putting all this stress on our body, and yeah, sure, I got an autoimmune diagnosis, what I really see is that I was in a hypothyroid state. And so if you've read the work of Dr. Rhoda Barnes, and you can understand, hypothyroid, the unsuspected illness, and all that can come from being in a low metabolic state, it makes sense why things like PUFAs, which block energy production, or being in a calorie deficit for a prolonged period of time, having excess stress, and that can come from your lifestyle, that can come from your diet, it can come from the environment, which is another thing we've recognized. So all of these different factors, I think what Ashley was trying to say is that overall can reduce the amount of energy that your body is able to produce. And that is where we see disease come in. And so, right, is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, like the body is a system, right? Like we really can't break it into individual parts. And so every part of that system requires energy production to some degree. And so when we aren't producing enough energy systemically, the weakest link is going to go out. You're going to experience problems at the weakest link.
Yeah. So yeah, all of this to say, our view on health has shifted a lot over time. Like when we were first learning about, having an autoimmune disease, we just accepted that that was something that people have. And, you have this, so you have to eat a certain way to deal with it. But rather, I see it now as there's a way in which to improve energy production and allow your body to fully heal, where you can then maybe tolerate some of these foods that you believe to be bad at this moment. And so the way I see different diets like carnivore and maybe keto or animal-based, which I follow animal-based diet as well, is that they allow the body to get back to that state in which it can produce energy efficiently, it can heal, you provided the nutrients it needs without all of the gut distress. And then you can maybe in the future, get back to all of these different foods that we might not consider good at this moment.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
The Weston A. Price Foundation and looking back at our ancestors, like a lot of them did consume grains with fermented sourdough bread, but again, maybe they didn't experience this really stressful time in their life where they were in a hypothyroid state and thus have digestion problems. And so because they nourish themselves like all throughout their life, their gut is super strong. They are really good at producing energy. So they're more resilient and they can handle a wider variety of foods. Whereas someone who maybe went through a really long period of restriction, they're maybe not at a state where certain foods work for them. So they do have to kind of hone in on their health a little bit more, improve their energy production, improve their thyroid status and metabolism.
Yeah. Well, they also didn't have glyphosate and genetically modified wheats and all this crazy stuff. Yeah, you laid it out earlier, they were drinking mother's milk and they had a good microbiome, and everything they were doing was pretty much consistent with how we should live at the time, even if we're just talking about the 1800s. And it's not like these were hunter gatherers living the really optimum human lifestyle, but they could still handle making bread, and they were properly fermenting it, and they were doing the whole thing. So that's super important. Super important topic is the energy production, which we'll get into more, and also just your journey a bit more, and the pro metabolic approach, which is very cool. I was just looking it up. I've been doing more and more podcasts on this for the last couple of years. I interviewed Kyle Mamounis, is a PhD, over 2 years ago in January 2021 about this. I've interviewed who else? Keith Littlewood, Kate Deering, and a couple more people. So I'm trying to kind of cover this more because that's where you two have landed. But I don't know if it's good for people to jump straight there or not. We can talk about that, right? You're talking about going to animal-based diets, and maybe carnivore was part of your journey that was helpful to get your guts intact and gut lining intact. And so let's just go into that more of the journey, because it's super hard. I mean, everyone starts somewhere. Just starting at low carb could be amazing. Just starting at keto could be amazing. Carnivore could be amazing. Could be necessary.
Oh, absolutely. So just to give some background on our journey then, before we go into more kind of what we think about pro-metabolic and stuff, we, like Ashley said, had the autoimmune diagnosis, and that kind of just kickstarted our dive into alternative health, which started with fasting, which then ended up with more keto, and then it went to a year of carnivore. And then from there, we kind of found more of Ray Peat's work and the pro-metabolic ideas. And so in a few years ago, I don't know what year it is now, we started to introduce more carbs after we went carnivore. And that was a really enlightening point in our journey, because prior to that, we had followed 3 different things that kind of demonized carbs in a certain degree. But I think reflecting back on it now, it is so important to recognize the state of your gut and your tolerance of different carbohydrates. And so, having bloat or having all of these symptoms come on from eating a certain carb is more of an indication of dysbiosis in your gut or an overgrowth of bacteria in your small intestine, as opposed to carbs being evil and that humans shouldn't eat them. And so being able to make this distinction allows you to have more food awareness instead of food fear. And so that's a huge part of what we try to educate people now, is recognizing these nuances and, hey, here's what's actually probably going on, and we can do these things. And then in the future, you should be able to tolerate this food, right? So coming at it from that perspective, as opposed to like, you need to be on this restrictive diet forever. But with that said, I do believe things like lowering carbs, right? If you have some overgrowth in your gut and you lower the carbs, possibly that will reduce symptoms in that time frame, right? Because you're no longer feeding these things. That can be therapeutic for a short period of time, but you have to move on past that, our belief at least, in order to efficiently heal your metabolism into the future. So things like carnivore, I fully believe is very healing for people, because they are eliminating all of these stressors on their body in terms of, your dietary stressors. There's other things like we talked about, glyphosate, the environment, but you're getting a large chunk of that stress away. And so your body does have now the bioavailable nutrients from animal products to heal. So that was a huge part of our journey. And then, like I said, we started introducing more carbs. But another thing that we've learned along this journey that I think kind of sets us apart from other people who have had, maybe they went carnivore, then they started introducing carbs and everything was fine, is we moved into a moldy house. And so that really opened up our eyes to the impacts of biotoxins on the metabolism, especially for a certain subset of humans who cannot detox these biotoxins themselves. And so if you think about it, it makes sense because a biotoxin, let's say we're talking about something like actinomycetes or even endotoxin is a biotoxin. If we're thinking about, let's say, eating food like a starch that upsets the gut, what's happening is we are increasing endotoxin in our body, right? And so it's eye-opening to recognize that you could have the perfect diet, but your environment could be contributing to your endotoxin load. And so all of this to say, this has catapulted our, learning forward because we had to take a step back and recognize like, hey, diet's not everything. You really have to look at all facets of your life and identify what is your root cause and what is your trigger for what's happening. It's most likely not just, carbs are evil, which at a certain point in time, we believe that because we did experience the benefits of, eliminating carbs for a certain period of time. But with this larger viewpoint, it really puts things into perspective, and it kind of gives you a map of what you may need to do in order to fully heal.
Just to piggyback on that, I think it's one of the biggest things we've learned from, going from a plant-based diet to then keto to then carnivore. We definitely saw symptom reduction, right? But there is a difference between like symptom reduction and long-term healing, because what we learned along our carnivore journey, we experienced noticeable improvements in our digestion problems and autoimmune symptoms because we were stopping this like massive assault on our gut with just massive quantities of vegetables, right? And so, of course, we experienced benefit right away. However, after a prolonged period of time, our metabolism started to downregulate. And so I think that that's a very important thing to remember, is that some of these really restrictive dietary approaches in the long run can come with metabolism suppression, thyroid suppression, and that's going to hinder energy production for the body as a whole. And then that can lead to a negative spiral of impacting digestive issues, because when your body is producing less energy as a system, it's going to prioritize that energy for tasks that are going to keep you alive, such as making sure your heart is beating, making sure that we're breathing, making sure we can see. But non-essential survival tasks are going to be downregulated. So things like maintaining elevated body temperature, making sure your limbs remain warm, digestive tasks are going to be downregulated. And so after a year of carnivore, we started to notice these metabolism suppression effects. And so that's when we started to realize that, hey, maybe we do need to take an alternative approach. And that's where we learned about the work of Dr. Ray Peat, Dr. Broda Barnes. And we started taking our body temperature and realizing, wow, my body temperature is 96.5 degrees Fahrenheit. That is not a good sign of metabolic and thyroid health. And so I think, just like Sarah said, taking these restrictive approaches for a short period of time to at least establish a baseline, see some improvements in symptoms, but then realize that in the long run, this extreme restriction can have metabolic and thyroid costs.
Super important. That's why I'm doing this content more for people. There's a lot of people that kind of dig into what worked for them in the beginning, and then they just don't want to hear anything else, and they're just carbs are evil, and then they're going to go to their grave with this. And I've seen all kinds of negative consequences from this. I've seen people get way too skinny. I've seen and have other health effects, have super low body temperature, cold all the time, low thyroid function, and there's a whole host of things that come with that. And I've seen people even gain weight because they initially lose a lot of weight, and then they'll gain it because their metabolism's so bad, they can't. They can only eat so many calories because they're not functioning well. So now they're gaining weight because their body can only handle so few calories because it's dysregulated. So let's go into that more. So specifically, I think you guys talk about your story publicly about losing your menstrual cycle, at least one of you, and being too thin and too many stressors on your body.
Yeah. So I don't want to discount carnivore at all. And I think that there are certain tweaks that people can make that maybe make it more therapeutic, like ensuring, they're getting enough, good animal fats and stuff, so they have enough energy. But I do, from my personal experience as well as Ashley's, is that in the long term, I think that most people would benefit from shifts towards including some low toxic carbs, which is basically kind of what I'm guessing you're doing with your animal-based diet. And
Well,
so,
so explain what those are, because I also wanted to explain the huge difference between carbs. I don't even call it carbs. Calling it carbs is like just calling it a vehicle. I'm like, are we talking
yeah,
about a tank? Are we talking about a moped? Like, are we
yeah,
talking about, like, there's so many types of vehicles. It's like the carbs,
okay.
like, we still believe these refined sugars, refined grains, highly, these are completely different than something like a sweet potato or a squash, or it could be
Okay,
some,
yeah,
yeah,
that's an
yeah.
important distinguishment. So I think a lot of people just box carbs in with all processed foods. Like they see a granola bar and they're like, that's carbs. But in reality, that's vegetable oils with high fructose corn syrup
And
and
grains coated in glyphosate.
fortified grains with iron. And so that's not food. So when we're talking about carbs, we're talking about whole food based carbs. So the carbs from milk, for example, or raw honey, fruits, roots, and even some starches if you tolerate them, which is heavily dependent on your gut health. So that's going to be like potatoes and sourdough bread, for example. So that's what we're talking about when we mention carbs.
Honestly, I really think that you can't even create a list of ideal carbs because I think everyone's tolerance to certain carbs varies. So one of the main principles of Dr. Ray Peat is to reduce the endotoxin load in our body because that can have a negative impact on estrogen, serotonin, histamine. It's this nasty cycle. And so finding a group of carbohydrates that your body digests relatively quickly is, I think, ideal. So for some people, certain fruits may contain fiber that doesn't work for their gut microbiome at that certain point. And so I personally believe finding a group of carbohydrates and fruits and roots and simple sugars are going to be a little bit easier for your body to digest because they're absorbed by human cells a little bit quicker. Whereas if someone has like a slow digestive tract and they have an overgrowth of bacteria, and let's say a certain food group contains a certain amount of fiber that just sits and rots in their gut, that's going to feed the bacteria and then just make that overgrowth worse. And so there's just so much nuance to this discussion of carbohydrates, and it really depends on the current state of your metabolism and your current gut health. Because I think something that we saw in the carnivore community and something that I was guilty of at some point was like wearing this badge of honor of like, I only eat meat. And so I'm like superior. But in reality, if you take a step back, someone who is able to tolerate a wide variety of foods, that is health, right? Like that's a sign that the gut is like you don't have leaky gut. You have a strong gut. You have a quick digestive tract that moves things through your body relatively quickly. And so it's really hard to come up with just a specific list of carbohydrates.
Yeah.
But
And you asked, like, should you just dive into the pro-metabolic space too? And I think that that is actually a really bad idea. I think
Yes,
slow and steady is
for sure.
always the case. And if you even look further into Dr. Ray Peat's work, a lot of people like to try to categorize it as like ice cream, orange juice, and sugar, but that's really not, what he preaches. He's actually a lot closer to carnivore and animal based than most people would assume. He favors things like milk, right? And you need your liver and your oysters and your seafood and your meat to get your nutrients. And then he adds in things like fruit, but even when it comes to fruit, he's very selective based on the different fibers because some fruits are very highly allergenic to people at certain stages of their life. And so his entire goal is just to allow somebody to find a diet that works for them and allows them to heal, which isn't that the exact same thing as carnivore? And so in my experience, I jumped into pro-metabolic very quickly. I did gain weight, but I was also trying to get my period back. And you mentioned us to talk about that a little bit. But I do just want to provide some perspective because we do work with people now who come from restrictive dieting backgrounds and then they jump into a certain way of eating. They may gain a ton of weight and they're like, holy crap, like what happened? I now have to lose all this weight. And so when you are at a lower metabolic rate, maybe you have a higher toxin load and your liver is more congested, you are not going to be able to process a high amount of carbs. You are going to see more things like blood sugar issues. You're going to wake up more in the night. You're going to feel worse. And so what I've had to circle back on and really think about for people in our course, and also just my own experience dealing with mold toxin, like I mentioned, is, what actually is working for my body right now. And maybe that's a higher percentage of fat, adding in some simple carbs for energy, for thyroid. And instead of just jumping into this idea of pro-metabolic is a very high carb diet, let's just go do that. That's not going to work for somebody who hasn't eaten carbs in 2 years.
Yeah.
You have to consider, where you're coming from and recognize that maybe these negative reactions that somebody would have is because we've overdone it, or we're not considering our context, or recognizing that maybe, we induced insulin resistance from not eating carbs for all these years. So all of this stuff can be reversed, but
Slow
it
and
takes
steady.
a very meticulous, slow and steady approach, especially with somebody with chronic illness, to come out of a state of a very slow metabolic rate. And so that's, we experience that ourselves. I'm not going to lie, we're still, experimenting. I think that the idea of perfect health is a myth. Everybody's still experimenting. And so it's just about finding what works for you. And that's, at the end of the day, everything that Dr. Ray Peat, even the Carnivore Diet, kind of promotes.
So circling back to the carb thing, I think when someone is trying to transition out, something that we've noticed success with our course students is kind of figuring out like the different types of fiber and the amount of fiber that works for you. Because if you jump, like let's say you were carnivore, pretty much zero fiber. And then if you jump straight into a pro-metabolic approach and you just consume a ton of fruit, a ton of starches and things like that, your fiber load could jump to like 40 to 50 grams a day. And that is a huge shift for your body to be able to handle and tolerate. And so if you had any overgrowths that were just being suppressed, you're now feeding the overgrowth with a ton of fiber. And so then I would just say that being conscious of your total fiber intake and the types of fiber, so insoluble versus soluble fiber, seeing what works best for your gut and making sure you get daily bowel movements, aren't super bloated, I think that would be a really good step. And so, starting with raw honey, some people tolerate maple syrup well, kind of those simple sugars that are easy for your body to digest. And then experimenting with certain fruits, even orange juice. I consume orange juice. And I would say starting with those and then venturing into starches that are properly prepared, something that you guys talk about a lot. The way that our ancestors prepared these starches, which are large particles that do need to be like broken down a lot in our digestive tract. So doing some proper food preparation to help your body with the digestive process would be important as well.
So explain to people, because people always freak out when you mention orange juice. And, the honey people kind of get and the maple syrup. Yeah. But then if you're talking about chugging orange juice, you could lose some people. So kind of explain that thinking.
Yeah. Well, I think first off, chugging orange juice is probably the problem. We probably shouldn't be chugging it. And that's where most people, I think they have, okay, there's probably different situations here, but let's say somebody came from a very restricted background and now they are chugging orange juice because they have this craving that they can't satisfy. That is a problem. I don't think, let's also say we are still eating a very high fat diet and we're adding in all this orange juice. That's going to cause problems. So I think the idea behind the orange juice is that it is kind of devoid of fiber. And so it acts similarly to the raw honey in a sense where it's very easily assimilated by the body and absorbed higher up. So it's not necessarily contributing to somebody's overgrowth necessarily. There are also a lot of anti-inflammatory compounds in orange juice.
Yeah. So the benefits, it has a lot of anti-inflammatory flavonoids like naringinin. It's got vitamin C, potassium, B1, folate, and magnesium. And it's a relatively easy to digest carb source because it contains both fructose and glucose. So people think that it's just fructose. No, it contains a mixture of both. However, context, if someone's main goal is to not gain weight or to not like it, or is to lose weight, drinking a ton of liquid calories isn't always the best idea. It's not very like filling. And so again, context. But orange juice itself is not devoid of nutrients. It's not just straight sugar. It actually does contain a number of nutrients. And so for someone who can't digest the fibers in oranges well, they may tolerate orange juice.
Yeah. And I think Dr. Repeat mostly recommends it for the minerals that are available in it. And so there's common quotes of him saying like, okay, 2 quarts of orange juice or something a day plus 2 liters of milk is like, that can heal anybody. But that's just, if you were to email him to, back in the day, that is a common recommendation of just eliminating the hard to digest foods, the foods that might contribute to your overgrowth. And so in a way, it's kind of a similar idea to going on a carnivore based diet. You're eliminating things that could potentially cause an allergic reaction in your body and elevate histamines, etc. And so I don't think that pro-metabolic in orange juice is like synonymous. You don't have to drink orange juice to be pro-metabolic, just like you don't have to, take raw honey in or something. So it's going to come down to the same experiments where maybe that really doesn't work for somebody, or maybe it goes down super well. So,
yeah, I think it goes back to the problem of creating these good and bad food lists and people staying really dogmatic to these and kind of forcing something on them that maybe doesn't work for them at this point of their journey.
Yeah. I love to talk about this stuff, and I talk to so many people about it and hear so many different experiences, and I've had people tell me both sides. And I know a guy that's doing it now, and he can chug orange juice and he feels amazing, and he thought he had to do carnivore, and now he's doing great, and he's learning about pro-metabolic, and it's working, and it's awesome. So there's a lot of context, even the lower fat or context. That's hard to talk about too, because Sarah was saying, hey, you can't be high fat, super high fat diet, and then add, cups and cups of orange juice. That's not going to be good. And so then people are like, oh, what? So now I have to go on a low fat diet? I'm like, no, not low fat. No. Explain the fat story, because you said PUFAs earlier. And I realize sometimes in my podcast, people don't know what PUFAs are. PUFAs are polyunsaturated fats. And let's do a little fat breakdown and why you shouldn't be low fat. It's just, there's more context.
Yeah, I think fatty acids is just a huge confusion point for people, largely because, mainstream pushes high PUFA. So they encourage high omega-6 and omega-3 consumption, and saturated fat still gets demonized year after year. And
just for the people, it's like all these vegetable oils and seed oils. These are what we were told to eat because they have lower saturated fat and higher PUFA, which is a polyunsaturated.
Yeah, and when you dig into the literature, it's mind blowing, because you'll see the authors of the study say, even though omega-3 or even though PUFAs are known to be heart healthy because they lower cholesterol, these are very unstable molecules in the body. And so you'll see this discrepancy like come up study after study after study. And it's just that this idea of lower cholesterol is just brainwashed into people. Mm-hmm. And it's very well documented in the literature that PUFAs are very unstable molecules. Saturated fat, on the other hand, is much more protective in the body. It doesn't produce as much toxic byproducts when that fat source is burned for energy. And so I think that that's one of the reasons why like animal fats are so healing, because saturated fat is so protective. It's a much cleaner energy to use relative to PUFAs. And you'll hear a bunch of people, bring up the Randall cycle, which is that if you're looking at one cell in the body, that cell can either use carbs or fat for fuel at any given moment of time. And while yes, that's true, different organ systems in your body use different energy sources. So because I'm not in ketosis, my brain right now is using 100% glucose. However, every muscle in my body is using fat. And so that's just an example of using two different fuel sources at one time. muscle uses fat for fuel when at rest, but then when you're in the gym, fat is too slow of a fuel source, so it will use carbohydrates for fuel when you're exercising. And so I think, this thing called moderation, eating all of the macros in moderation, can be a very valuable way of viewing things. It also eliminates really dogmatic, restrictive thinking and realizing that there is a time and place for all the different fuel sources in your body.
Totally different type of moderation. That's the problem, is because eat in moderation is advice I hate from the mainstream, because they're talking about eating the food pyramid, and they're talking about eating like 1 ounce of meat and eating a million grains and processed foods.
No, yeah.
Yeah. But specifically on like the PUFA, I actually have some data pulled up that we were looking at earlier. So polyunsaturated fatty acids, omega-6 are definitely going to produce a ton of like toxic byproducts, and omega-6s are really high in vegetable oils. So, you hear a ton of people talk negatively about vegetable oils and seed oils. Well, this is a relatively new phenomenon for humans. There was a 1,163 fold increase in soybean oil consumption from 1900 to 2000. And so that's just like a huge change in the types of fats that humans are consuming. And we are kind of like, our fatty acid profile is kind of representative of the types of fat that we consume dietarily. And so the more PUFAs we consume, the more PUFAs that we'll have in our tissues. The more saturated fats we consume, the more saturated fats we have in our tissues. And so the internal environment of our body is kind of impacted by the types of fat that we consume day to day. So that's going to impact the integrity of our gut lining. So PUFAs are, specifically omega-3s, are known to kind of disrupt the gut lining. They increase the permeability by affecting the tight junctions along our gut. And so this is just something that mainstream doesn't really talk about, is like the types of fat impacts the internal environment of our body, and the internal environment impacts the amount of like reactive oxygen species that you have, the amount of oxidation that occurs, so the amount of like toxic reactions that are happening in the body, and over time those can build up and cause more and more damage in the body. So something that Dr. Ray Peat and the carnivore community agree upon is like saturated fats are the best types of fat. They're the most protective, they're the most healing, they have the least amount of oxidation potential. What were you?
Yeah,
Sorry, what'd you say?
stable. Yeah, the
Yes,
most
the most
stable.
stable. Yes, because the inside of our body should be 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That's relatively hot. And so, like, fatty acids can oxidize in certain temperatures. And so, these PUFAs are a lot more unstable in higher temperatures. That's why, like, fatty fish like salmon, who are in cold water, they have high levels of PUFA because it's such cold temperatures. Whereas in warmer waters, the fish don't have as much PUFAs. They have a higher, relatively higher amount of saturated fats. So I think just really considering the amount of different types of fats that we're consuming is a really important pillar of health.
Okay, it is important because most of this is just about the ancestral context. And I think that's one of the just most solid things you can do. You can do a bunch of science, and you can look at these tiny little, this myopic, you get really myopic, right, over these tiny little things, but you got to zoom out and be like, okay, what are our human bodies used to? And I just know it's not seed oils, right? And there's some people pushing back. They're like, okay, it's okay. And if you have, I'm like, I mean, yeah, like if you have like 1 drop of it, it's not going to kill you. It's not like a toxic substance, but this is just not the ratios that it's natural to the human body.
Oh, no. And like what Ashley was talking about, the disruptions with the gut. And I mean, I know we were raised on seed oils. Like my mom owns a restaurant, and so that's where we ate growing up. And that's, restaurant food is laced with seed oils. And so we see these rising rates of autoimmune disease. And I mean, it's really no question. Like what's happening, there's a ton of other factors as well, like stress and environmental toxins. But if we are unstable to a certain degree and our guts are already leaky, like there's really no question as to what's going on there and what we should maybe revert back to. in order to heal. And that's definitely not eating more seed oils.
Well, yeah, Brian, what you're saying, like, another thing to think about is like the whole concept of hibernation. And so it's so weird that these principles aren't applied to humans, but it's well documented in the literature for like bears and other animals that go into hibernation. These animals increase their PUFA consumption before they go into hibernation to downregulate their metabolism
Yeah.
when they go into hibernation. Like, this is well known. And then now here we are for humans saying the more PUFAs, the better. And it's like, that is going to downregulate your metabolism to some degree.
Yeah. And that's what I've seen. It's these downregulated metabolism is a huge problem. I guess we should go back to that because that kind of happened to you too with the keto and, too much, not that you were eating all the PUFAs and causing it, but the downregulated metabolism. We didn't finish that story because I remember seeing you guys online and it was like too much. Well, if you're doing physique competition, then maybe it's good to be super shredded. But actually, I don't think that's good at all. There's a guy here in Austin that I met recently, Nick Bear. He's kind of popular online. He's like a physique competitor, I guess, or does run all this stuff. He showed his hormones during his cutting. He got shredded like to the bone, and which I commend him. He showed his results. He had like the ranges of testosterone. It was like less than zero. Everything was off the chart, completely gone. His hormones were tanked, and he showed the world. Thankfully, I think that's great. Like, do not do this. So tell us more about your story because we kind of skipped.
I think a lot of competitors who end up with a health issue speak out about this because, I mean, Ashley's pulled up studies for a course before where like even just a small period of time being in a caloric deficit has a significant decrease in your thyroid hormone conversion from T4 to T3, like astonishingly. And that's going to impact energy production. That's going to impact your overall health. And so if you're maintaining that long term or you're going through cycles of, competition prep and then you take 3 months off, like sure, you took those 3 months off, but you're never going to be able to accommodate for all of the damage that you've done over the course of however many years you're doing this. And so this also applies to long-term caloric restriction for the sake of losing weight. And maybe you can't lose weight, but obviously we know what's going on there. Or, just unintentionally under eating or over exercising and not eating enough. And so, I mean, we did that for over a decade, basically. And so, yeah, I don't think that is talked about enough in regards to what actually happens when you eat low calorie for a long period of time. And
your body's protecting you.
Yeah.
It's a protective mechanism because your body keeps score. Your body is smart. It's tracking what's happening. It's measuring the amount of inputs and the amount of outputs and the energy requirements of the system as a whole. And so when it recognizes that there's not enough energy coming in to do all of these, like everything in your body, every enzymatic reaction, every function requires energy. So when your body knows that there's not enough energy coming in, something's got to give, right? And certain things are not vital for your survival to live the next day, right? And so those non-essential tasks are going to be downregulated.
Yeah. And so, like I said, we exercised a lot. We did a lot of fasted training. We did powerlifting for many years. I did a bikini competition. We have many years stacked up of not eating enough.
Oh,
and that
our adolescent periods
does take a toll. And so it's really no question that we had problems getting our menstrual cycle, right? And so the fix to that was pretty simple to an extent. You have to eat more. And some people do get their periods back. Let's say they're doing keto or carnivore and they just increase the fats and they make sure they're eating enough. They do get their cycles back. Like, I think that really does go to show how powerful and healing saturated fats are. But there are also interesting studies and people who have pioneered research in regards to consuming carbohydrates and the impact on female hormones and blood sugar regulation and how important that is for fertility. And so there's also that you have to kind of consider as well. And so we considered both. We obviously ate in a surplus. We obviously included carbs. We got my cycle back. But yeah, like always, there's a lot of nuance there, but I think that the overall thing that somebody should grasp from this is if you're eating too little food, that's going to damage your health long term, and it would benefit somebody to maybe like somebody might be saying, hey, I have no idea if I'm eating enough, right? Like maybe I'm still holding on to weight, but I feel like I'm eating less and less and less. Track your food for a few days in chronometer and see where your calories are at. And if they are under 1800 calories and you're not losing weight, you need to reverse diet out of that. And you need to start eating more food to allow your body and your metabolism to heal.
Yeah.
The
I
correct
think
food.
it's like a
The
negative.
correct food. You're right. Don't.
Yeah.
I just want to jump in there because, yeah, a lot of people, there can be completely different versions of this. Someone could be like, oh, I'm supposed to eat more food, and they're just eating more standard American diet. If you dial it in correctly, we should be able to eat a lot of calories. You want your body to eat a lot of calories as long as it's the correct food and you have all your nutrients, your protein, your vitamins, minerals taken care of. Then,
Well,
yes,
Yeah.
Brian, there seems to be a little bit of a disagreement in that, because some people in this longevity space are now promoting that like lower
oh,
caloric intake is better for longevity, and they, bring up the rate of living theory, and like we are slow burning candles, and the slower we burn, the longer it will be lit. And that is a fundamental difference in human physiology and what is optimal for the human. The work of Dr. Ray Peat and the pro metabolic view is no, exact opposite of that. We want to be burning quickly. We want to be burning fast. The higher metabolic rate we have, the more energy our body is producing, the more functions can turn on. And so it is a difference in like kind of the base view. There are some longevity spheres out there saying being in a caloric deficit is good for you in the long run. And, for some people who are overweight, of course they're going to see some benefits from
yeah.
losing some weight. But what is an optimal, like if you take a step back and think of the human body, one body is given restricted calories, the other body is given an abundance of calories from good, great food sources. Which body is going to thrive? I think the answer is kind of
Oh,
obvious.
it's so easy. The problem is most of these studies are done with the standard American people. If there are
Mhm.
even studies done, it's so super hard to do longevity studies, obviously, right? But it's like, yeah, of course, 90% of America needs to lose weight. But
Well, and Brian, the studies that are done on mouse models, Kyle Mamunis brings this up. So you've interviewed Kyle Mamunis before. The studies that are done on mice, their quote standard chow is very high PUFA, and so
it's
again,
soybean oil and like grain or
yeah,
something. It's
well, and
ridiculous.
even lard. So they'll say that lard is highly saturated, but that's not the case. Like the fatty acid profile of lard has changed over the years as we fed pigs more and more corn and soy. So again, digging into the studies and seeing what these people or mice models are
Mhm.
eating is
Yeah.
important.
That's well, I remember what the idea was. It's like, yes, if you're eating less of this terrible diet, you're gonna live longer. Right?
Oh,
So it's
yeah.
like that doesn't mean that eating less is gonna make you live longer. Anyone can Google these like calorie restriction society people. They look like they're gonna die. There's so many reasons why you don't want to be emaciated. Okay, even if they are right, which they are completely not correct, I will just say that outright. Even if they are correct, if you're emaciated and barely hanging on and you had a miserable life and you live 2 years longer, who cares? That's stupid.
No, exactly. Yeah, like in the amount of like just daily torture just to go through and just be starving and starved of energy too. I mean, uh,
Yeah.
I
Well, it's
do
not what
want
you
to.
should do.
What'd
We
you
got
say?
to just put it out there. It's not what you should do at all. It's
Yeah.
you want to eat the correct amount of calories, really. I mean, yeah, you don't want to be overweight and overconsume, obviously, but if you maintain the best way to have longevity is to have an ideal body composition for as long as possible. And so, if you're gaining weight, then apparently you're eating too much because your body has to store some of that fat.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
yes, dial
if
it in.
you're gaining weight, and that could, I mean, that's obviously going to be a different amount a different amount of calories for everybody, but it's really important to recognize here your thyroid. And if you're eating a low amount of calories and you're gaining weight, then you are hypothyroid. And
Your
so
metabolism has been downregulated.
yeah, and there's a few things you have to consider here. Is you have to consider why is this happening, and then you also might have to temporarily or permanently supplement in order to no longer be hypothyroid. And so hypothyroid might be because of your diet. You're eating a ton of nutrients that are blocking thyroid conversion. It might be because you've never detoxed in your life and your liver is holding on for dear life and it can't convert thyroid hormone from T4 to T3. It could be because you have gut distress. 20% of your thyroid hormone is converted in your gut. And so there are so many different things that could be going on that are the reason that you're not losing weight. And it's probably not because you're eating too much.
Weight loss shouldn't be super hard.
Yeah. And so when it comes to kind of getting to the bottom of that, I really think somebody has to look beyond diet and recognize everything that could be contributing to their life right now that is blocking this conversion of their thyroid hormone. Now, there are cases where, you have Hashimoto's, maybe your thyroid has been, eaten away at, or you got your thyroid removed. Like, these are different cases, but I'm talking about for most people who don't actually have a problem with their thyroid. They have other systemic problems going on that is resulting in hypothyroidism that is not being solved. And they're doing everything possible with their diet and their health, and they're still not losing weight. And I think this is why Dr. Ray Peat's work is really powerful. Dr. Broda Barnes as well, is hypothyroidism is likely a cause of all of these different symptoms, and you need to get to the bottom of it. And in the meantime, here's what we should do, right? You need to get enough nutrients in your diet. You need to reduce stress. You need to eat enough. And so that's where we see reverse dieting being very helpful for some people, because suddenly they're eating more slowly, like they're gradually increasing the right foods in their diet, and they're seeing their cortisol lower. They're seeing their nutrient intake go up. They're favoring better, easier to digest foods. So their digestion's getting better. They're assimilating nutrients more. They're converting thyroid hormone more. And they actually can end up losing weight when they're eating more. So it's very cool shifts like that I think it's very scary for people to consider, right? Like, if you are already overweight, you're dieting and you're going to now eat more, that's very scary. But sometimes you have to go against the grain and take a larger physiological viewpoint to recognize the root cause of something, and recognize that you might have to go through, a few months of healing that are tough to get to a better place in the end.
Yeah, because calories in versus calories out, it does matter. But there's a big but. The state of your metabolism and the state of your thyroid will impact like your basal metabolic rate, which will impact how many calories you have to consume to lose weight. You shouldn't have to consume 1,200 calories to lose weight. Like that is screaming that there is a problem.
It's not going to be sustainable. It's going to cause other problems. Everything's wrong with it.
Yeah.
You will gain the weight back.
Do you know what's the guy's name? Fire in a Bottle?
Oh yeah, Brad Marshall.
Brad Marshall. He brought up this fascinating data from one of the first times USDA recorded data on like the amount of calories that Americans were consuming. I want to say in like the early 1900s, Americans like on average consume like 3,500 calories or something extremely high. Whereas today, if people were consuming that, they would be gaining weight, because I think our metabolic, like Dr. Peat and Dr. Broda Barnes has outlined, so many people are experiencing subclinical hypothyroidism, which means that your body is naturally burning less calories at rest. You are less efficient at utilizing and creating energy. And so that's just like screams. There has been a huge shift in our metabolic rate and our thyroid health because of our lifestyle and our food choices.
I was going to bring up Brad Marshall and that exact point about the calorie stuff, and that we used to eat a lot more calories. And what you're talking about is not breaking the law of thermodynamics. There might be some calorie bros out there yelling at their phone and, their earbuds right now. But like, bro, it's just calories. You can't break the thermodynamics. Like, we're not saying that. There's two sides of the equation. There's your consumption and then there's your expenditure, right? And then that's what we're saying changing. Your thyroid regulates your expenditure. And there's many things that affect your expenditure. And there's so many things, like, are you absorbing it in your body or not? Like this is not breaking thermodynamics. It's just providing a lot more context to it.
Yeah. And honestly, the whole goal of providing more context is to provide hope for somebody, because it's really easy to feel like you've tried everything and that you're just chronically ill, or you can't lose weight,
or that you're like a failure because you aren't doing things the way that someone outlined it.
But the calories in, calories out argument is, like Ashley said, calories do matter. I mean, we're not talking about, when we say reverse dieting, we're not talking about adding 1,000 calories at once. We're adding 50 to 100 per week or so if you want to take it really slow. This is very small shifts to allow your body to adapt. And that's usually what we have to do when we're coming from a restrictive diet. And now we're learning a little bit more about animal-based with fruit or pro-metabolic, bioenergetic. We have to take it slow or else you will gain weight. I mean, it's...
Well,
Go ahead.
that's a good point, because also back to what we've been saying, it's the right calories, it's the right food. And so I just want to make sure, because some people, they think that they're, eating a good diet, and then they hear this and then they're going to try to add more calories, but they're still eating out on the weekends, and they're still like drinking on the weekends, and they're still like, no, you can't just be eating like seed oils and refined sugars, added grains, like all this stuff. Like you have to remove those, or it's not going to work.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Like,
there is an interesting book, Eat for Heat by Matt Stone, I believe. And I think that he has a very similar ideas as like, let's increase the metabolism, but he does take a different approach where he does encourage eating that food that you crave, right? Eating more calories, eating dense foods, not living off salad, greens, and air. And I think that can be very therapeutic for somebody. Obviously, their metabolism is going to upregulate provided that the blocks are no longer there. However, if we're thinking about long-term health, with which I think that we're all trying to exemplify here, is we want to consider what our body's made of. We want to consider long-term function, cellular health. And I don't believe that consuming tons and tons of seed oils and fortified grains and foods that are tough to digest are going to benefit somebody long-term from a gut health perspective, thyroid perspective, and metabolic rate.
absolutely. And Ashley, we're going to say something?
Well, yeah, like the amount of fats that we consume day to day, like it really does impact our long-term health, because those fats stay in us for a long period of time. Is the half-life like 2 years?
Something like that.
Oh, yeah.
2 to 4 years. And so again, that the types of fat that we're consuming. So if we're just like throwing in a bunch of like processed food with a ton of vegetable oils added in, which most of it is, or if we're eating out on weekends, like you said, all the time, and just adding in a lot of these vegetable oils, those PUFAs are going to add up, and that's going to have a negative impact on our health in the long run.
That's a good point. We also should talk about the difference in the whole foods. We kind of been dancing around it, or you've been talking about fruit, honey, some starches, some tubers, underground, stuff like that. So this is leaving out all the nuts and leaves and seeds. So just to make that clear, that's kind of the animal-based approach, is that you don't want all this stuff. It's kind of the opposite of all the stuff you mentioned. We're talking about hard on the gut, hard on digestion, lots of anti-nutrients. If you want to go a little bit further into those things.
Yeah. So Paul's done the Carnivore MD has done a really great job kind of introducing this idea to people who maybe were carnivore in the past, and, exemplifying and showing his animal-based diet, eating more fruits, raw dairy, raw honey, easy to digest carbs. And I think he's had a few conversations with Georgie Dinkoff on his Instagram or on his YouTube about endotoxin, serotonin, gut health, all these different things. And so when we're thinking about what we should prioritize in our diet, I think that one of the main considerations is ease of digestion. We want the body to be able to assimilate and absorb those nutrients with the least amount of struggle, the least amount of negative byproducts, or the least amount of time for something to sit in the gut and overgrow or allow for overgrowth. And so we personally, and I think that this is more of like the bioenergetic view, animal-based view, do not do things like raw nuts and seeds. Those are higher in PUFAs to begin with.
They're also very hard to digest.
Tough to digest. So when it comes to things like seeds and grains, the preparation is very important. And this is where like the work of Weston A. Price comes into play. Are you going to ferment those beans or grains or seeds? Sprouting, soaking. There's many different things you can do that our ancestors did in order to make these foods, first off, more digestible, but also the nutrients more bioavailable and getting rid of anti-nutrients. And so if you're going to be eating these foods, which, I mean, a healthy person should be able to eat these foods, then you just need to prepare them properly.
It's like a pre-digestion step.
Yeah. And so, gosh, if you're coming from a healing diet though, and you're just, dipping your toe into adding more different foods into your diet, I think that's where it is beneficial to maybe stick with things like fruits, well-cooked fruits, raw dairy. If you're going to add in dairy, make sure you at least raw or from a really great organic source. Maybe start with raw cheese. So there's levels to this, but I think the end point is these different foods in their raw form are very tough to digest, and it kind of goes against everything that the bioenergetic approach is about, which is ease of digestion, right? More and more nutrients absorbed, less strain on your body, less endotoxin production, because that's going to allow for a better metabolic rate.
But mainstream says the exact opposite.
It
I
is
know,
more
you're supposed to
leafy
eat giant
greens.
salads all day, I thought.
Yeah, and I think if someone is still really stuck in this like mainstream nutrition advice of more leafy greens, more nuts, more seeds, just take a step back and look at the digestive systems. Go to Google, look up the digestive system of a cow. Look up the digestive system of a gorilla. Look up the digestive system of a human. We are very different. And there's a really interesting group of papers in the literature that talk about how in human evolution, we made a huge shift where the size of our digestive system decreased so that we could have more brain power. And so again, we are humans. We have a limited amount of energy production available to us. We can't just continuously produce energy. We are human. And so at some point, we had a shift where more energy was put to our brain and less energy was put to our digestive system. And so that's a superpower, right? So now we have higher thinking capabilities. We're able to accomplish more and better and more advanced tasks. But that means that we shouldn't be spending as much energy on our digestion. And so that's kind of sets us apart, is like literally how our digestive system is designed is very different than a ruminant animal that can extract energy from grass. We can't do that. Sorry, we can't do that. We have different needs. And so I think spending time learning about the different digestive systems of these different animals is really enlightening and eye-opening, and it is really insightful as to what humans should be eating. And it kind of reminds you of like, okay, that makes sense. I should be prioritizing things that are easier to digest, because then I can make more energy and I can accomplish other tasks. And then my digestive system isn't bogged down by bacterial overgrowths or slow fermenting these raw kale greens. Humans can't digest and break down cellulose. We can't.
I don't remember what I was listening to, but there's an example given of like in the 80s, the low fat diet craze. They increased the amount of fiber because it was indigestible. It didn't give you energy. And so now we had bulk.
Skinny.
We could lose weight because we weren't getting anything from our food. And so is that really our goal? To not obtain any
well, then just eat sawdust. Yeah, just fill your food with sawdust.
Oh, exactly.
The whole point of eating is to get energy for our body to function.
I mean, again, there's nuance
and energy,
with like the gut microbiome and stuff. And I know there are people who see a lot of success adding in some, vegetables well cooked and all these different things. Again, it's so contextual though, because if you're coming from a place of dysbiosis, it's not always the best idea to just cram more fiber in. We want to achieve a better gut microbiome first, which might actually be possible without fiber in the diet. So there's a lot of context there.
And the gut, I love talking about the human gut, and that's how we start out the film, or the Food Lies series. It's 6 parts now, but we go back to the beginning and we talk to the people, the anthropologists, the scientists that are doing this research, and we're explaining it to the audience. Like, the human body is designed to eat these nutrient dense foods. Like, we shifted, like you said, it's called the expensive tissue hypothesis. And we got more energy to the brain, less to the digestive system. The large intestine and the small intestine basically reversed from what it was with primates, right? And so we require these nutrient dense foods, like the animal foods, the organ meats, the raw dairy. All these things are required, and even the pre-digestion is kind of required. It's like, that's why humans are so smart, is we figured out that we needed to pre-digest our foods before we eat them, because we require such nutrient dense foods. So when we couldn't get animal foods, or to supplement animal foods, we would have to pre-digest the plant foods by cooking, sprouting, fermenting, soaking, doing this to make them more available to us so we could survive. So this stuff it's not debatable, really. Like, yes, you could survive on a salad. I mean, you're not going to die. And yes, some people who eat more salads in the mainstream tend to be healthier. And that's just the healthy user bias. And that's a whole nother rabbit hole. And my quick view on it is, yes, these people are eating less bad foods because they're eating these salads, right? That's part of the healthy
Absolutely.
user bias. It's like, what are you avoiding because you're eating a whole bunch of salads? You're
And they're
not
also
going to McDonald's.
exercising.
Yeah, you're not drinking, you're not a lot, you're not going to McDonald's, you exercise, all these healthy behaviors. And so we just know though that there's a certain array of foods that our body's designed for, and that's how we can operate optimally. And that's what we've been eating for a million years, right? Before we were even Homo sapiens, it's like we were eating nose to tail animal foods. We were eating some roots, some honey. It's, what I mean? That's just what we had. Like, this is not really debatable. I don't know why it's debatable.
We literally domesticated dogs so that we could better herd ruminant animals to eat.
Yeah.
Like if you look back, like lamb and herding sheep have been a part of our history for so long. And then also thinking about, like the readiness, availability of food. You have, for vegetables and crops, you have to plant a seed and wait a number of months for that to grow. Whereas like a ruminant animal that's producing milk, that you can obtain that right here, right now. So if a group of people were exploring a new area, what's the best way to get food instantly? Bring that ruminant animal that's producing milk and drink the milk as you're traveling along. So it's just, yeah, animals have been a part of us and our tradition for so long.
I was with the Maasai a couple of years ago, and yeah, Saladino was with us. Well, he left early, but we went to Tanzania. We spent time with the Hadza and the Maasai. They wake up and drink the blood and the milk of the cow, and then they keep going with their day. And yes, they can travel with it. And this is what we've done. The Hadza, they're going for the meat first. They're going for all the animal foods. They're going for honey if it's around. And then if there's nothing else, they start digging for some tubers. And this is a big point that ties in the fiber stuff. These are super fibrous tubers. These are not a nice sweet potato where you just eat it and it's delicious. This is something they cook for a long time on the coals. They sit it by the fire. Then they like peel off the skin and then they gnaw on it. It's like sugar cane where you just gnaw on it and you get a little bit of juice out of it and then they spit it out. So they're spitting out all the fiber. They do not eat it. You do not. And I ate it with them. They gave it to me. This is what the women, the men were out hunting. The women were chewing on some tubers. I think this is actually a huge thing that I need to look into more. That's in the literature that is bogus. A lot of stuff's bogus in the literature, but I think this is almost fraud. Do you remember these things? They're like they ate 100 grams of fiber per day. Hunter gatherers eat 100 grams of fiber. Blah blah blah. They have the best microbiome. They don't have bowel cancer. Blah blah blah. I think this is bogus research done by biased scientists that counted all of these tubers as the fiber count in a giant, 1 pound tuber when they weren't eating any of the fiber.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, so Dr. Ray Peat does talk a little bit about this. And so I'm sure he cites some interesting literature. He believes that the small intestine should be relatively sterile. And the small intestine can't be relatively sterile if there's a ton of fiber that's sitting and fermenting in the small intestine. And so again, it just kind of depends on like your digestive speed. But if you're someone that kind of has like a little bit of like constipation and then you're downing a bunch of fiber and that's just sitting and fermenting in their digestive tract, like that's not going to lead to a healthy microbiome.
Yeah. And a lot of your digestive issues can be solved by solving your hypothyroidism. Because if you have a slow transit time, like she said, there's more time for things to ferment. And so that's really cool that you had that experience, like up close and personal with maybe what's actually going on there. I always like to just make this, because I know maybe a lot of your listeners come from maybe a carnivore background, maybe keto, or they're diving into pro-metabolic. There are so many similarities between carnivore and then pro-metabolic Ray Peat's work, because we're getting rid of a bulk of those fibers, right? We're trying to make our digestive system operate better. We're reducing the amount of things that allow for overgrowth. And really what we're just looking at is two different fuel sources.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe one's necessary at a certain point of healing. Whereas if you can upregulate your metabolism and tolerate more carbs, that just means that you took another step with your health. So it's just moving, along this spectrum of maybe what you tolerate right now. But the goal is the same. We're getting rid of the fiber, we're healing the gut, and we're trying to improve the metabolic rate to find health. So I always like to kind of when I talk to somebody who's coming from a carnivore background and they just can't, like people who can't fathom the orange juice. Hopefully this kind of connects some dots as to why we might consider orange juice in reasonable amounts as opposed to eating the orange for some people because of the fiber.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you are active, it seems to work better for active people. And if you are not eating like super fatty diet, you can't eat keto plus orange juice probably. So I want to try something. I want to see if I can give you, it's almost like case studies, and you have to, because you guys, work with people, clients, health coaching, whatever it's called. I'll start with one because we talked about fiber and you talked about constipation and stuff like that. I feel like half the females I know are constipated all the time or something. It just seems like this thing they can't do. They think they need to just eat more fiber. So someone, we'll call mid-20 female. They're like, I'm not regular. I try to eat fiber. I'm eating some animal foods, but I still want to eat my spinach. What do you think?
Okay. So there's a lot to consider there. The first thing I would definitely consider is your body temperature. Because if we're in a low energy state, we are hypothyroid.
Well, yeah, your body temperature is going to give you insight as to your metabolic rate, which then tells you, is your body producing a lot of energy?
Right. Because a huge component of hypothyroidism, which doesn't mean you're doomed with that, it's just a state you're in, is constipation. Things are slowing down. Everything in your body is slowing down. And so, there's a lot there, but I think if we can get a grasp on our starting point, right? Like, okay, let's say we took our temperature and we're 96.5. That just means you need to work on moving in the right direction with your metabolic health. And so what that looks like typically without medication is removing the tough to digest foods. So we're going to stop favoring raw vegetables. We're going to stop favoring raw nuts and seeds and grains probably at this point in time and favor more easy to digest things like ripe fruits, well cooked, like squashes can be good for some people, more grounding if they need it. And then, like they already are doing, eating the animal protein, the animal fats, favoring things like that, making sure they're eating enough. Right. So we probably don't want to be under 1,800 calories. And that's a large blanket statement. I'm just saying that because most people should not be eating under that. Obviously, your height, weight, past dining experience comes into play, but we want to be shooting up more towards 2,000, 2,200, 2,400 if we're a fertile female, right? So, especially being in your mid 20s, you want to be setting the body up for success to develop a child if that's your end goal, which is not everybody's, but yeah. So I think the starting point is getting a grasp on where you are with your metabolic rate, which is easily accomplished by your temperature and your pulse.
Multiple times throughout the day.
Yeah.
A few measurements.
And then from there, we're going to start removing the tough to digest foods. We're going to prioritize the easy to digest foods. We're going to make sure we're eating enough. We're going to look at lifestyle factors. We're going to try to reduce stress because if you were under eating, if you were over exercising, that's going to contribute to constipation. It's probably not helping your metabolic rate. So maybe peel back if we're doing a lot of longer state cardio, maybe prioritize 3 weightlifting sessions per week. On the flip side, if we are sedentary, that can contribute to constipation. So making sure we're walking throughout the day. We want to be active to a certain degree. And so these are like the very foundational diet and lifestyle exercise things that we would look at first that can usually help resolve constipation. But I think in terms of the dietary component, removing the hard to digest foods should be first and getting more of those very nutrient dense foods, organs, raw dairy, fruits, roots, those kind of things, favoring that should help. And then if that doesn't do it, then we need to start looking at things to boost the metabolic rate externally.
I would say, the people who are really tied to eating their fiber to form the bulk in stool, I think an alternative way to think about it is rather than adding more and more bulk to your stool, let's work on increasing the speed of our digestive tract, increase the amount of energy that we're giving to our digestive tract so that it can move food through us quicker. So rather than trying to push more down there to push stool out of us, let's work on improving the way that our entire digestive tract, which includes like musculature, involuntary musculature contractions to move food through us. But those muscular contractions require energy. They require energy production to make that happen. So instead of trying to like throw a bunch of fiber into us to push stool through us, let's work on improving the way that our body just functions as a whole. So experimenting to find what provides relief in the moment, with also in parallel working on improving our thyroid and metabolic rate is a good path forward.
I think for most case studies of women in their 20s is that they're not eating enough food.
Oh, for sure.
And, you know, like she said, in the meantime, we have to get stool moving while we work on that metabolic rate. And that's where things like magnesium can be helpful.
Yeah.
You know, these are tools, though. They shouldn't be forever things that we rely on.
Yeah.
I like it. I have two more. So maybe I'll stick on this theme of women not eating enough calories. So the next one would be maybe later 30s, can only eat 1,400 calories a day, or they gain weight, has been doing keto for many, many years, kind of like cold hands and feet. Basically just if they eat more than 1,400 calories, they just start gaining weight. And I've just seen this before, and they're stuck in this sort of low metabolic state.
Can I start?
Okay, sure.
I think putting on muscle is extremely advantageous at this age. And so kind of really reflecting on what type of exercise you are doing and being very intentional with your exercise selection. So not going in the gym to burn calories, but instead going in the gym to progressively overload and improve your strength, which will then build more muscle over time. And so I think looking at exercise and your activity level is super important. Daily steps in strength training.
Okay.
And
so
then
that's from an exercise standpoint.
That's from an exercise standpoint. Do you want to take the dietary?
Oh, okay. So I'm thinking with both of these cases, if we were hypothyroid, we're estrogen dominant, it is pretty synonymous there. And so we need to start thinking about getting out of this estrogen dominant state, getting our metabolism up. So if we're coming from keto, we're eating 1,400 calories. Gosh, first thing I would look at is, are we eating enough protein? Again, like building muscle, we have to have enough protein. And so I would just go for like anywhere from 0.8 to 1 gram per pound of body weight.
And then also looking at the types of fat that you're consuming. So a big thing in keto is these nuts and seeds are fair game.
Yeah.
The more nuts you eat, the better.
Well,
let's switch those to animal fats.
Yes. Keep going. I like it.
Okay, so we've looked at protein. We're talking about fat now. Now, since we're stuck in this low metabolic state, we've done keto for a long time, we need to start with very simple, easy to digest carbs when we're going to be adding them in. And this is a very slow shift in the diet. We want to start peeling back on the fat a little bit and adding a little bit more carbs.
So and that would, as we add carbs, slightly decrease the fats.
Yeah. So we have like
an
exact.
Yeah, you got to seesaw it. Yeah.
Yeah, seesaw. We have an exact like blueprint of this that we go walk through with the people we work with. But basically, the simplest way to do this would be, let's say in the morning with your breakfast, you had eggs with butter with a MCT oil in your coffee, all that stuff. Take out the MCT oil, okay? Or take off the extra butter and add a serving of fruit.
Or honey.
That's a really simple way to just add in a little bit of carbs, not making this huge shift. And just from that little bit of fruit, easy to digest carbs in the morning, they might actually see positive improvements. And so making those shifts over time and then simultaneously looking into potentially using supplemental progesterone to help overcome the estrogen dominance. And we're talking about like bioidentical progesterone. So not like progestine that you would get from the doctor, but just the like Progest-E that you can buy online, or there's a lot of different ones. So sometimes we have to use these tools to get us out of this hole that we've dug. And a lot of times just changing the diet, especially at that age, is not enough. And so those are kind of what I would start with
shifting your hormonal balance will impact your metabolic and thyroid health. So again, back to that calories in, calories out. Yeah. The amount of hormones that you have in your body will impact your calories out.
And I think Dr. Broda Barnes says this the best, is like hypothyroidism is the most overlooked but easily treated thing. And so if this person has been in this state for a long time, it can be beneficial to think about, once they're eating enough protein and they do all the nutrition and lifestyle things, if they need supplemental thyroid support for a period of time to get them back up, that can be very therapeutic, and there's no reason to look down upon that. So
that's not just T4 though, because T4
we're talking about like NDTs or T3 or something like that, combination T3, T4. So there's a lot of nuances there, but definitely start with the diet and the exercise and lifestyle, and then see what you need as far as support as you keep working through this.
We have just seen hundreds of women in our course that have come in saying like, I've gained 20, 40, 50 pounds going pro-metabolic. And if you taking a look at their data, they simply kept their previous dieting strategy. So let's say it was keto, and then they just added carbs on top. And that's just not how we should do it.
Of course. It just doesn't make sense. So good advice. Yep. Always strength training over all the cardio. I hate the steady state cardio stuff. More protein for sure. And dial up those carbs while lowering the fat. But keep it the good sources of those, of course. Okay, now we're going to move up the age range. We're doing a male, 40s, 50s. We got like the dad bod guy, kind of standard American guy. Although not standard American guy. This guy's been doing, again, low carb stuff for 5-7 years, all about it. Lost the first 80 pounds. Magical, right? Amazing story. Lost 80 pounds, but it's like the last 30, the last 25 that won't go away. He's been there for years. Thinks low carb's the only way to do it. It's not working. What does this guy do?
Oh, okay. You said he's keto right now?
Well, pretty much, yeah.
Pretty much.
Well, so just call low carb. I don't want to do all the same, right? The last example was keto, just low carb, right? So it's low carb. And it's just, it won't work. It won't work. It's just these last 25 pounds won't go away.
That's tough. I think the exercise point is the exact same here. We need to prioritize muscle building.
Yep.
I would say
the reason
before you go on, I got to put this in here because I've been talking to Dr. Ted Naiman about this recently. It's that low carb and keto is great for people who don't want to exercise. There's so many people who are 40s, 50s, diets haven't worked for them. They did keto low carb and it went away and they lost a lot of weight. It's not like they have perfect body composition. A lot of weight came off. They don't want to exercise. And it's almost like a crutch where you don't have to exercise and you can lose weight. But all humans need some sort of movement. They need some sort of muscle, right? So keep going.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very important consideration, is like the state of health you are in determines how much movement you can do, determines how much carbs you need. And so, like we've said before, that's why these diets can be very therapeutic for somebody who's chronically ill. But I don't really think we should be encouraging laziness to a certain extent. But that aside, this case study here.
The strength training, because the more muscle you have, the higher your basal metabolic rate. So the more calories your body is naturally burning at rest, which means that you can eat a higher calorie load without gaining weight. So the more muscle we can put on, the better.
I think for this individual, there's this framework for an animal-based diet out there that really just doesn't say don't eat less meat, or it doesn't even say go low fat. It just encourages being more aware of eating simpler sugars. And, maybe you're not now 70% fat, you're 50% fat, but you're 50% fat with fruits and honey to allow for a little bit more energy production. Or maybe this is just enough to get that thyroid working a little bit better. And so I would start there. I wouldn't make a huge shift jumping to a high carb diet. I think that just even going to, 20%, 25% carbs in your diet could be enough to get this person out of this rut. And again, this is things like raw honey, fruits, raw dairy. We're not talking about granola bars and, even nuts or seeds really, right? So taking out those, similar to the 20-year-old with constipation, taking out those harder to digest foods from the lower carb side, keeping the meats, right, to a certain degree, making sure they're good meat. And then going more animal-based, which I think is kind of outlined as about 50% fat, 30
so that
can 20%
be like
carb
a little
protein.
Transition, the next step out. And then I think also considering the amount of calcium in your diet. So I think that that's a big problem in the carnivore space, is very heavy phosphorus, low calcium. and that can have negative implications on your metabolic rate as well. So there's studies documenting that a more balanced calcium to phosphorus ratio can improve energy production and improve your metabolic rate. So start maybe swapping out some of your meat for more dairy. And so again, the types and amount of dairy someone can tolerate will be impacted by your metabolic rate and your gut health, which are intimately connected. And so maybe starting with some hard aged cheeses that don't have a ton of additives in them, that can help better balance your calcium to phosphorus ratio, which will benefit your metabolism in the long run.
Yeah. We got to look at it as like what we get to add in, not necessarily what we're taking away. So like, yeah, we might be taking away, 2 out of the 4 pieces of bacon. So we get to add in, a pineapple, like half cup pineapple or something. Like that's exciting, right?
Yeah. I love this advice. I'd give much of the same advice myself. And wow, we got to get going here. We could have talked about regenerative agriculture and all the stuff you're doing on your farm. We could have talked about so many things. Give us a quick 2 minutes on your what are you guys doing over there?
A lot of expansion this year. So again, I think a regenerative model is very well-rounded. It's not just a monoculture in terms of a single animal species that you do. So we're trying to add more variety to the farm here. So by the end of this year, we will have our dairy operation set up. So we'll be selling raw goat milk, to local herd share customers, and then we'll also be shipping. We will be able to serve a lot more egg customers with our low PUFA eggs. We are getting 800 more chickens for more eggs. We're adding in meat birds. So we're going to have some low PUFA chicken there, and
corn
and soy-free pigs and lamb. So that's kind of where we're headed here at the farm. And we're still small scale right now, but we have a really great team, us, and then Sarah's fiance, Brandon, and then a new team member, Masha. So it's us 4 that are trying to grow the farm.
That's so cool. You're living the lifestyle. Where do people find you?
Yeah, so we're active on Instagram, and that's at strong.sistas. Our website's www.armstrongsisters.com. And on that website, we have our offerings, which is like a course that kind of helps people walk through everything we talked about today. We have an exercise membership, Strong Training, which helps people build muscle, gets people off the cardio bandwagon, and different things there. So yeah, and then we have got our farm, which is on Instagram, angel__acres.
But you could just search in Google Angel Acres Farm.
Yeah. And then that also will link you to our website, which is where we'll be offering what we currently offer and then what we'll be offering in the future from our farm.
Very cool. Well, we offer some of the same stuff at Nose to Tail too, because it sounds like you're pretty local. We do more nationwide stuff with Nose to Tail, and we have the low PUFA, corn-free, soy-free pork, which is still on our site. Sorry to have to throw my plug in there, but
we love your products. Yeah,
absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks so much. Yeah, I've loved following your journey, and we had you on the Sapien podcast a couple of years ago with Dr. Gary. Yeah. Maybe we'll start the Sapien podcast again someday. But good times, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having us.